Today we are going to start an extended conversation about what we might call the problem of distinguishing things of the world as art versus things of the world not art. I'll use art and non-art for convenience. We could also say art versus everything else. How do we determine something is art instead of not art? Are there any criteria to help us in this determination? Fortunately, many great thinkers have considered the same question. Over the course of a few discussions, we will look briefly at various answers to the question, understanding that we can only touch the surface of a very complex discussion. We will begin with Robin G. Collingwood, who is a philosopher, archaeologist, historian, and aesthetician, someone who studies aesthetic questions. Collingwood will do two things for us. Firstly, he will provide a starting point for considering art versus non-art. Secondly, he will provide us with terminology that we can use to analyze arguments as we go forward. Let's take a look at Collingwood's view of art. To do so, we'll go back to his book, Principles of Art, published in 1938, in which he argued that works of art are essentially expressions of emotion. Thus, he is a proponent of what is known as an expressive theory of art. The duty of the artist is to clarify and articulate emotions through works of art. Collingwood suggested that art may be recognized by applying the following four principles. 1. In art, there is a difference between actions and ends. To make this clearer, a baker breaks eggs into a bowl, however, the eventual end of the work is a cake. The breaking of eggs is not the cake. There is a distinction between the method or steps and the eventual end result. 2. In art, there is a difference between planning and execution. For example, a carpenter plans to make a table and the plans are drawn up. Later, the table has to be made out of solid material. The ideation of the table or the planning of the table is different from the making and finishing of the table. 3. In art, there is a difference between raw materials and the finished product. A block of marble is different from a carving of a figure. 4. Craft itself is not art. Through craft, an artist may transform raw materials into art. For example, a company takes wood chips, a raw material, and makes a finished product called plywood. This plywood is now a new raw material that may be transformed into a table. Craft brings together various raw materials for the creation of art. In art, ultimately, the raw materials should not be displayed or obvious or detracting. Instead, the raw materials should be assimilated into the overall whole quality of the finished art. Keeping these in mind, we remind ourselves that Collingwood believed a main point of art was the expression of emotion. For Collingwood, art is not simply doing something well, it is simply not craft. Therefore, the standard of art is not art's resemblance to the real world. Does it look just like what one sees? But instead, does the art evoke the feeling one experiences when engaging the real world? Collingwood noted that the painter Vincent van Gogh, in painting a portrait, quote, leaves out some things that he sees, modifies others, and introduces some which he does not see in his sitter at all, end quote. Why would Van Gogh do this? Collingwood's reason is that Van Gogh was striving for the expression of emotion rather than the literal representation. Interestingly, Collingwood thinks that the artist does not often know what emotion is going to be expressed when working on a piece of art. The emotion is like a secret, only to be discovered in or after the making of the art. Collingwood said that an artist who starts to create may be conscious of, quote, a perturbation or excitement which he feels going on within him, but of whose nature he is ignorant, end quote. The artist in the passion of creating would say something like, quote, I feel, I don't know what I feel, end quote. Empowering, and it's all the artist can do to get this emotion out. Once the work is done, the artist is relieved of the burden, freed, Collingwood says, as though, quote, a sense of oppression has vanished. His mind is somehow lightened and eased, end quote. Artists feel taken over by emotion. They must express it and then they get it out of their system. Collingwood then apparently hopes that everyone who looks at the work of art will feel to a similar extent the same emotion the artist felt as evoked by the work of art. We can identify lenses that many people lacking a high level of education in art use to determine or value art. They often look for emotion, saying, I don't understand it, but it feels so, They can't quite describe what means, or they say, quote, the technique is so great it must be great art, end quote. Would they agree that a pianist, never having learned to play, banging the keys while tearing their hair out and bawling at the piano, in other words, doing something full of emotion, is art? Probably not. Would they agree that a highly crafted garbage can is art? Probably not. Before we end up, let's introduce a new term. This is, quote, necessary and sufficient conditions, end quote. Necessary and sufficient conditions are guarantees, musts. Having four sides is a necessary condition for a thing to be a square. Regarding art versus non-art, a necessary condition, X, must be fulfilled for a thing of the world to be art. If this condition, X, is not fulfilled, then it is impossible for the thing to be art. For Collingwood, a necessary condition for art is that the thing is more than simply the raw material. If the thing is only a raw material, it has not fulfilled the necessary condition to be art. Now we'll move on to the sufficient condition. While four sides are necessary for a square, the criterion alone is not sufficient for a thing to be a square. A square must also have four right angles. Think of a square versus a parallelogram. Regarding Collingwood, it is necessary that raw materials are transformed for a thing to be a work of art, but for him this is not sufficient. Also necessary for art is that the created thing evoke or convey emotion. As we go through various theories of what differentiates things of the world as art or non-art, we will be spending a good deal of time looking for the jointly necessary and sufficient conditions that each theory presupposes. We will look for rules or criteria considered necessary for a thing to be a work of art. Then we will ask if the rules or criteria are sufficient for all things of the world that have been accepted as art. In doing so, we will notice two things. A, we will find that everyone who distinguishes art from non-art presents a set of rules, stated or not stated. And B, we will discover problems in creating sets of rules that include or exclude previous and or future things of the world accepted as art. Next, in discussion 1, part 2, Collingwood in Metaphysics, we will look at presuppositions with the goal of eventually linking them to necessary and sufficient conditions.